Hello Miners and welcome back. I'm doing something a little bit different this week. I wanted to take some time to share my thoughts on the Legacy format with the upcoming banned and restricted announcement coming out on March 31st. I did get a chance to kind of share a brief overview of my thoughts on the Eternal Durdles podcast recently, but I wanted to make my own video so that I could go more in depth and list some of my reasoning and some other thoughts that I have on the format and what I would like to see happen and what I think WotC will end up doing. So we're gonna start off kind of going over the legacy format in general. So by the numbers, according to the MTG Goldfish metagame page, I'm a little worried that WotC is going to see this and read into it that there isn't actually a problem in the format when there is. Just looking at the breakdown of the decks and the metagame share, you do see a good spread of various decks and archetypes in general. You see tempo, you see combo, you see big mana. But if you dive a little bit deeper into what this is actually showing, you do see a rather problematic trend here because of the fact that this is broken down by deck and not by archetype. You have to look a little closer to be able to see that blue X tempo decks are actually about a quarter of the meta at this point. It doesn't look that way because it's broken down into the individual versions of it. But if you were to just group this together as your blue X Days, Force of Will, Wasteland decks, you see you've got the Dimir Reanimator deck, which there's some argument whether or not that's combo or tempo. I personally label it as tempo. Dimir Tempo, Teamer Delver, Izzet Delver, all of that together ends up clumping to about 25% of the meta, which historically above 20% is kind of where you start seeing, like, okay, this is a problematic deck. It's just because the archetype is spread out over a number of different versions of that deck that it doesn't jump out right away as being like, okay, the format is clearly being dominated by this one particular strategy. So that's the clear sign that something is off when a single deck is a quarter of the format on its own and something in it needs to be addressed. The community in general has agreed that at the very least something out of the Dimir Reanimator deck needs to go. But seeing as all of the Blue X tempo variants combined are a quarter of the meta, that is a sign to me that it's actually something out of the Days, Force of Will, Wasteland shell that is what is dominating the format right now, and something needs to hit that to actually decrease the overabundance of that strategy in the format. So you end up going down this rabbit hole when you want to nerf the top deck of the format, where when it's a deck like this, in the case of Dimir Reanimator, where there's actually two game plans in the deck, which side do you hit? There's a lot of conversation currently about attacking the Reanimator side of the deck, going after something like Entomb, which is a hyper efficient tutor to put your big fatty in the graveyard, going after Reanimate, which is the quickest way to get it back out of the graveyard, or going after one of the big fatties. Most people are thinking maybe Atraxa because it's just too good at what it does and it refuels your hand after you blow all of your resources to get into the graveyard and reanimate it. But with the fact that you also have all these other blue X tempo decks at the top of the format, I am of the opinion that it's actually the tempo side of the deck that needs to be nerfed more than the Reanimator combo side of the deck. If the Reanimator combo side really was what the problem is, we would see an abundance of traditional Reanimator decks running around the format as well. And we just don't see that right now. So the way that I read this is the Reanimator combo side of the deck is more of an oops, I win button than anything, and it's actually being propped up by the tempo side of the deck, which is allowing it to get to a point where it can either protect the combo in way too efficient of a way, or the combo is just kind of an incidental, like, okay, I want the game to be over faster. I've already exhausted my opponent of their resources by playing the tempo game. Now I can just hit the oops, I win button. So if you go after the tempo side of the deck, then you're talking about banning something out of the Force of Will, Daze, Wasteland package, and all of those are considered format pillars. WotC has in the past said they don't want to touch format pillars. There's a lot of nostalgia and strong opinions in the community about going after anything in that package there. Personally, if I were to go after one of those, I believe Daze should be the target. I think land destruction in the form of Wasteland is a good thing to have in the format. It punishes greedy mana bases. Land denial strategies are fine and healthy as long as there's counterplay to them. And Force of Will is the police of the format that stops everything from just devolving into turn one combo deck races. So I think Force of Will is still good for the format. Daze you typically will only see either in tempo or combo decks, and it basically enables degenerate things to happen extremely quickly on limited resources, or it punishes other decks by taxing them early in the game in a way that is beneficial to the caster. Bouncing a land typically isn't really going to be that big of a drawback when you are just completely stopping your opponent from doing anything, and then being able to follow up with something like a wasteland to destroy their land, so you set them back a turn, or you're able to reuse a surveil land to keep your plan going. That being said, I do hate to be advocating that maybe Daze needs to leave the format. I know budget is a big thing, and when I first started, Daze was my budget Force of Will. I know that's not really a good argument in the sense of legacy as a whole and the health of the format, but that is just something that I always have in the back of my mind, is that a lot of people first getting into the format, if they can't afford Force of Wills, Daze is kind of their backup plan there. But that being said, if we're not going to touch the pillars of the format on the tempo side of the deck, and the reanimator side isn't really the true problem of the deck, the card that I would suggest to nerf the Dimir reanimator deck specifically, and then also hit some of these other blue X tempo strategies, would be to actually go after Troll of Khazad-dûm. It's a evasive large body that is going to end up in the graveyard pretty much regardless of what you do. The fact that it cycles to go find a land means even if you stifle the cycle trigger, it's the body is still going to end up in the graveyard anyways, and that's really where the Dimir Reanimator player wants it to be. So it's kind of an uninteractable entomb specifically for Troll of Khazad-dûm. It also allows these decks to be able to play through Blood Moon and Harbinger of the Seas. It lets them play through cards that should be able to hate out on their mana base without really caring, because they can just go find their basic swamp even when everything else is shut down and continue with their game plan regardless to be able to play their splash colors. It also enables what are traditionally very mana light and actually pretty mana hungry decks to function on what should be unkeepable hands. The cost of having 4 colorless lands in a multicolor deck is a real thing, and the fact that most of the time a deck, if your only real land is a wasteland and you're in a dual color deck, that's not going to be a keepable hand, but because of Troll of Khazad-dûm, they can keep the wasteland and still go find their colors no problem. It's basically like having an additional 4 polluted deltas in your deck that actually can function off of any land. So I think if you were to take the Troll of Khazad-dûm out of the deck, you are hitting both the tempo and the reanimator side of the deck without the collateral damage of basically nuking either archetype entirely. I don't think that this will solve the issue of the blue X tempo decks still being the best thing to do in the format, but I do think it will help at least nerf them a little bit, specifically the versions that splash black, and it will meaningfully nerf Dimir Reanimator itself without straight up killing it. But as I said, it won't just completely nuke the blue tempo shells entirely. It won't completely nuke the Reanimator strategies entirely as fallout from going hardcore after one side of the deck or the other if you were to go after something like Entomb, Reanimate, or Daze or Wasteland or something like that. So moving further down the metagame page here, the next few decks I think are kind of symptomatic of what's wrong with each other at this point. Mono Red Stompy is at the top of the meta, and I don't think having a Stompy deck toward the top of the meta itself is a problem. And the Mono Red version specifically really hasn't been a problem in the past, and I honestly don't think it is now. The reason it is so high in the meta is because just below that is Eldrazi, which is problematic. There are a number of different cards in the Eldrazi decks that people think need to leave the format. There's discussions about Sowing Mycospawn. There's discussions about the One Ring. There's discussions about Kozilek's Command. And I've even heard some people advocating that Ancient Tomb itself needs to go. On that last point, I do not think Ancient Tomb needs to leave the format. I don't want to see the death of Stompy as an archetype entirely. I love playing Stompy decks, and I do think that the Stompy decks are a fine part of the meta as long as they are not dominating, and I really don't think they are. The reason Mono Red Stompy is so high right now is because it has so many Blood Moon effects to punish the Eldrazi deck specifically, because the Eldrazi decks are able to just cheat on mana costs with stuff between Planar Nexus, with any of the postcards, with Urza's Tower, and then having Eldrazi Temple and Ancient Tomb and City of Traders. They just have a critical mass of multi mana producing lands to be able to cheat out their huge creatures that are just going to take over the game. And one of the reasons Eldrazi is so good right now is all of the Eldrazi that are being played have cast triggers, which are much, much more difficult to interact with than trying to interact with an ETB. And the bodies honestly are kind of secondary. Most of the Eldrazi are being played for their cast triggers. So something out of the Eldrazi deck does need to go. They have hit a critical mass of very strong, effective cast triggers tied onto what are honestly irrelevant for the most part bodies. But what do you take out of this deck is really the question here. A lot of people are saying Sowing Mycospawn needs to go. It essentially is a double Stone Rain for in an Eldrazi deck, basically 3 mana. It may look like 6 on paper, but because of this abundance of multi-mana producing lands, they are casting that turn 3 consistently, sometimes as early as turn 2, depending on the build. And because of the fact that they are cast triggers, you can't just counter them in a normal way. Consign to Memory was designed specifically to deal with all of the new Eldrazi that came out in Modern Horizons 3, and honestly, it's barely enough. A lot of the times, especially if you're on the draw, you leave up 2 blue mana or just a blue mana on something else to try to counter a cast trigger plus the body, and then your opponent just Sowing Mycospawns you, and then you're like, okay, well, I can either counter the body and one of the triggers, or I can counter both of the triggers, but they're still left with a 3/3, which doesn't sound like much, but I mean, it's still a 3/3 body that's going to beat you down. A lot of people are also saying that Sowing Mycospawn single handedly is the reason why control doesn't exist in the meta currently. I'm not a control player. I don't really have a strong opinion on that or enough practice with control to say that's true, but I can definitely see how a double Stone Rain that's very hard to interact with could definitely keep control down when they're a deck that wants to go into the late game and wants to have a bunch of lands in play, but they're not playing any real mana acceleration to be able to make up for the fact that you might just lose 2 of your lands. But again, that's something that I don't really have a huge opinion on. I do think Sowing Mycospawn is problematic, but if the main argument people are saying is that it is why control doesn't exist in the meta, I don't think that's reason enough to call for it to be banned. I think there are other issues in the meta currently as far as why true control doesn't have a presence. One of them being another card in this deck, which is Kozilek's Command, which modal spells are always going to be strong, but they normally have a limit of what they can do. The fact that Kozilek's Command is able to scale as the game goes on is just insane. The longer the game goes, the more mana you can dump into it and the more value you can get out of it. It also just completely spits in the face of the color pie by being a colorless spell and being able to basically do everything. It acts as ramp, it acts as removal, it acts as graveyard hate, it acts as card selection and card draw. It's kind of just an egregiously insane card, and especially in the decks that are running it, it's going to be cast for a large amount of mana very quickly. It also leads to a combo-esque finish with the help of Glaring Fleshraker, where you can get a Fleshraker on the battlefield, cast a big Kozilek's Command to scry, draw, and then make a bunch of dorks to go find another Kozilek's Command, which is going to be fueled off of all of those spawns that you made off of the first one. And traditionally, in the decks that are going to be playing that are going to mostly be artifact based decks where artifact hate is able to shut them down, but it allows those decks to be able to have a combo esque finish and burn you out from positions where you should have the game completely locked down and give yourself time to be able to win. And they just win out of nowhere by doing that off of essentially a single card. So I think if we're gonna hit Eldrazi, I think we need to go after Kozilek's Command before we start talking about going after glaring or going after sowing Microspawn. I do think Microspawn needs to be on a watch list, but I think we need to see what the deck looks like without Kozilek's Command first, because the command just does so much. It does it so well in those decks, and it can also go find you a sowing Microspawn and give you the colorless mana you need to be able to kick it even through something like a Blood Moon effect. So if we're attacking Eldrazi, Kozilek's Command would be the card that I would take out of the deck. Additionally, some people have been saying maybe the One Ring needs to go out of that deck, and that kind of bleeds into the Stompy Shell as well, because a lot of Stompy decks are playing the One Ring. It is a very good card advantage engine, but I'm not quite ready to call for that to be banned yet either. I think the decks that are really going off with it are able to be hated on well enough outside of pivoting onto the Kozilek's Command plan. Artifact hate in the form of null rod effects or collector oof just completely shut down the One Ring, so I think there is enough hate for that, but there's no real good way to deal with an Eldrazi player just going off with a Kozilek's Command, especially if they have something like a Glaring Flesh Raker already on the battlefield. So that would be my take out of that deck, and then just kind of keep an eye on Microspawn and see how it does after that's gone. Going down the metagame page, you now see a bunch of combo decks popping up. And there are some people saying the meta is like 50% combo, and then Dimir Reanimator, or if they consider Dimir Reanimator a combo deck, they lump it in there. And people have historically said when a format is dominated by combo, it's a bad thing. I think the presence of combo currently is actually symptomatic of what the decks above it currently are, because your best way to fight through your ramp decks, your stompy decks, and your tempo decks is honestly to just go faster than them, put them to the force test, see if they got the turn one interaction, and just win the game before they get a chance to do anything. That's why we're seeing the abundance of turn one combo decks in the form of Oops All Spells and Doomsday that can go off as early as turn one to just be like, well, if I win before you can do anything, what you're doing doesn't matter. So I don't think the combo decks themselves are honestly the problem. They are a symptom of the true problem, which is what the current top decks of the format are. I have seen some people saying that Oops All Spells has gotten too good now that we have a critical mass of MDFCs that are lands on the backside, so they can consistently get their mana under them better than they could before when they were relying purely on spirit guides and chrome moxes and lotus petals and stuff like that. A lot of the MDFCs also have relevant front sides to them as well, such as Bogart Trawler to be able to act as opposing graveyard hate. And a lot of the Oops decks are also able to pivot onto a creature beatdown backup plan by like ritualing out a Barrogoyf or something similar. I really don't think that is a problem. I think it's fine for combo decks to be able to have a pivot plan, especially something like that that is able to be interacted with in a meaningful way. There's removal, there's counter spells, stuff like that. Um, but I don't think having combo have a big presence in the format itself is a problem. It's the fact that the best way to try to fight these other top decks is to just simply go faster than them. So I don't think there's really anything that needs to be taken out of any of the combo decks at the moment. I do think if we were to nerf some of those top decks so that the format isn't encouraged to go as fast as possible to get under those decks, we won't see combo being as much of a problem. I also think that is more so the reason why control doesn't have a place in the meta currently, is just because of how blazingly fast the format is trying to go under stuff like Eldrazi and Stompy and the Demir Reanimator and the Tempo decks right now. So I think if we nerf some of the stuff above the combo decks, it will give a chance for other fairer decks that can work against these glass cannon combo decks to be able to come back into the meta and just naturally kind of slow the meta down a bit. And I mean, I will admit I am a combo player. It's a little bit of a selfish take, not thinking that combo itself is the problem. I am open to being wrong about Oops All spells. I don't think we need to nuke the deck entirely, but I'm not really sure what to take out of it just to nerf it without straight up killing it. Um, but I do think that what everyone is saying about combo being too much of the meta is more of a symptom of what's going on at the top of the meta than that combo itself has gotten too strong and is a problem in and of itself. So moving outside of the metagame as a whole, I think there are a couple of cards that should be addressed that are problematic for the format. The main one being Nadu Winged Wisdom. I'll start off by saying I don't think the card is too powerful for Legacy. It is the gameplay patterns that it produces that are the problem. The fact that the combo with Nadu is non deterministic means that the best thing for you to do when facing down a Nadu player that is going off is to just sit there and let them do their thing. There's no guarantee that they are going to produce a win, and there is always a chance that they are going to fizzle and not draw what they need to stop you from winning the next turn. However, this leads to you just sitting there while your opponent is just going off, and leads to very long games, especially on MTGO where there's a clock involved. It eats into the clock and is a bunch of game actions, especially if it is a build that also has Springheart Nantucko and you're producing a ton of tokens in the process. In paper, that's not as much of a problem because there are ways to organize it so you know what creatures you've already targeted and which ones you haven't, but there's no good way to do that on MTGO. So you're sitting there while you or your opponent, whoever's playing Nadu, is randomly clicking on creatures hoping they haven't been targeted yet and just wasting more time when realistically the game is virtually over, but there's always a chance that it fizzles and you're able to win on the back crack. Also, the fact that it is per turn means that if they have something like a Nomads in Core, they can just do this again on your turn, leading to the exact same situation. We've seen in the past that gameplay like this, which leads to egregiously long turns and a insane amount of game actions, has been considered problematic. We've seen this in modern with stuff like eggs. We've seen it in the form of Four Horsemen being shadow banned in Legacy because it kind of leads to the same problem where it's a non-deterministic loop and there's always a chance that the opponent fizzles, but you need to just sit there and let it happen, and it can just take forever for it to happen. So I don't think Nadu itself is too powerful in the terms of legacy. It's just the gameplay patterns that it produces are not healthy. I don't like advocating for fun or gameplay based bans, as what's fun for one person is miserable for another, and the nature of what is fun is purely subjective anyways. But the fact that it can lead to logistical issues and it incentivizes the non Nadu player to just sit there and let them do their thing in the minuscule hope that they fizzle, I think it needs to go just for the gameplay patterns that it produces on its own. Another card that needs to be talked about is Orcish Bowmasters. There were calls in the past to ban Bowmasters before the printing of Psychic Frog, and then when the Frog came along and the decks that people were complaining about Bowmasters in kind of switched over to Frog because it was just better for those styles of decks, the calls for the bans kind of dropped off. But once Psychic Frog got banned, a lot of people were saying, well, they're just going to slot Bowmasters back in that spot and it's going to be a problem again. I do think the card is extremely powerful. I would say it's borderline too powerful for Legacy. It just does so much and does it so efficiently. If it maybe had one less ability, whether it didn't have the ETB, it didn't amass orcs, or it didn't have flash, I think it would be perfectly fine. Is the fact that it has all three is really what almost pushes it over the line, if not does push it over the line. That being said, I don't think card draw hate is a problem in Legacy. I think it's a good thing to have to punish cantrips and card draw decks. It doesn't stop you from drawing the cards, which is a big thing. It allows you to still be able to dig to try to find an answer for the Bowmasters. And there are decks that draw cards that can just win through it regardless, whether it's protection from the One Ring or being able to get protection from something like Veil of Summer. There are also some kind of cool combo decks that are also using it as a win con, such as some of the newer versions of Black Saga Storm that are relying on this and Echo of Aeons to be able to go off. So I don't think I'm ready to say Bowmasters needs to be banned yet, but we will see where the meta goes to see if it does become problematic. I do think it's about one ability too much, but I'm not quite ready to say that we need to get rid of it, just that it needs to be watched closely and action taken if it does prove to be too much, as some people thought it was before Psychic Frog came into the format. So outside of the cards that I think are problematic and should leave the format or should go on a watch list, I honestly think there are a few cards on the ban list that could come off without destroying the format and be perfectly safe. I don't have a lot of in-depth knowledge on a few of them as they have been banned the entire time I've been playing Legacy, but just looking at their power level in the context of Legacy in 2025, I fully believe Earthcraft and Mind Twist could very easily come off. We have so many efficient discard spells as it is already, and one that just scales up with the amount of mana you have, I don't think is going to be a problem. I've heard some arguments about like, oh, turn one, land, dark ritual, mind twist your opponent. That's the same power level as turn one, dark ritual, thought seize him to Turok your opponent. Like, I don't think mind twist is too powerful given what's currently in the format and is just another option for a discard spell. I honestly don't even think it would see play if it came off the ban list. My more contentious pick, I think, is I would like to see Deathrite Shaman unbanned. I know in the past people have had arguments where it basically just homogenizes mid-range decks and control decks into always playing the one mana planeswalker, as people say. But at this point, mid-range and control decks don't really exist in the meta. and it might help prop them up a bit, giving them a form of ramp, graveyard hate, life gain, just things that they need to be able to keep up with what's going on in the meta. I also think that it would be able to help some of the more like check pile, four color, mid range, and control decks exist in a world where we have a ton of stuff like Blood Moon, Magus of the Moon, Harbinger of the Flood Moon, as I call it. To be able to fight through decks like that would otherwise just completely shut these greedy mana bases down in a fair capacity. Um, we also have a literal one mana planeswalker in the form of Tamia right now, and no one is complaining about that's power or calling for that to be banned. So I don't think Deathrite Shaman would be an issue in the current meta at all. It could be something to give a shot in the arm to fair decks. I don't think it's gonna homogenize stuff like it did in the past because you're not gonna be seeing it in like Delver style shells. They just have better things to do and are too efficient to want to be playing that at this point. So I think Deathrite Shama would be fine. I think it's kind of been power crept to the point where it's totally acceptable in the format. So I would love to see DRS come off of the ban list and rejoin its place in Legacy. So to kind of wrap this up, what do I think WotC is going to do at the ban and restricted announcement? Honestly, I don't think they're going to do anything. I don't believe they're going to ban anything. They're going to look at the breakdown of the meta and they are going to see there is no one deck that is 20% plus of the meta. They're going to look at it and be like, okay, we've got tempo, we've got stompy, we have ramp, we have combo. They're going to see it as a diverse metagame where pretty much everything outside of hardcore control is represented. I don't think they're going to look at it and combine all of the blue black tempo decks together and see that the blue tempo shell itself is a problem being at a quarter of the meta once you combine all the different variants of that style of deck together. They also have shown in the past that they tend to kind of just disregard legacy for the most part. They've even admitted they have ignored their legacy expert back during the grief ban and didn't listen to them when they said grief should have been banned and waited another ban cycle before taking it. So I really don't have faith that WotC is actually going to do anything. I think they will say that by the numbers, Legacy is fine, but they hear the community and will keep an eye on the cards that people are complaining about and address it in the next BNR. I really hope that's not what they do. I hope they saw the reaction from how heavy handed they were with Modern in the last BNR and see that that is what the community wants. They want to see action taken. They want to see stuff get unbanned that shouldn't be on the ban list. They want to see cards that are clearly problematic in the eyes of the community taken out of the format. But I just don't have the faith in Wizards to actually do that based on their past actions. The other thing that I wish they would do, but I don't think they're going to, is just get rid of these scheduled BNR announcements. Having to wait months to address a problem when they pass over it is just not acceptable. They let formats languish for months at a time because they can't take action between these scheduled BNRs. So I would love to see them take a heavy-handed approach to Legacy with this BNR, listen to the community, take our insight into consideration, considering it's clearly an afterthought to them, but then also just get rid of the schedule, address problems when they pop up, and deal with them then. I get their logic of not wanting to screw players over during RCQ seasons and stuff like that by having a deck that they've been playing get banned out in the middle of a season. But you also see that when they don't take action, the formats just languish, player interest drops, participation drops, and the format is just stuck in an unhealthy situation that it doesn't need to be in. So, unfortunately, I don't think WotC is realistically going to do anything, but I really hope they do. I mean, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Despite the fact that Legacy as a format has a ton of hurdles to get over to get players into it between the lack of sanctioned events and the reserve list gatekeeping a lot of new players out of the format, Legacy is alive and well. We have a very dedicated player base. We have a great grassroots community that is organizing events since Wizards won't organize them for us. This is not a dead format despite what WotC seems to think. It deserves the same amount of attention and action as any of the other constructed formats that WotC manages. So I really hope that WotC changes their tone when it comes to Legacy and starts giving the format the attention it deserves. But I guess we'll see if that happens or not. But anyways, thank you for taking the time to listen to me ramble here. If you have thoughts on anything I got to say or any thoughts of your own as far as the format as a whole or what you want to see or what you think WotC will do at the upcoming ban and restrict announcement, please feel free to share your thoughts down in the comments below. I will catch you all in the next video. And as always, stay salty. Play any of the decks you see on this channel with a Mana Traders rental subscription. With a variety of tiers to fit any budget, Mana Traders lets you play whatever you want in whatever format you want. Use code DasSourKraut at checkout and become a better player today. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you like what you saw. If you did, do me a favor, hit that like and sub button below. There are free ways to support the channel. And drop a comment, let me know what you like. Any kind of feedback you got, your opinions on my gameplay, the decks that I play, any of that kind of stuff. If you really like what you see, go ahead and drop by the Patreon. Become a patron, get to read some of my tournament reports and some stuff going on outside of just Magic in my life that I'm going to start putting over there as kind of my own personal blog. Also, you can do donation deck lists over there, just the price of a league if you have a specific deck you want to see, or you have an idea you want me to brew around, something like that, go ahead and do that. Nothing is required. It's always appreciated, though. Any donations go directly back into the channel, covering stuff such as leagues for donation decks or the rental program that I'm a part of. I am a small-time YouTuber. I'm doing this for fun. I really hope you all like what you saw. I truly appreciate you all stopping by. I will catch you all in the next video, and as always, stay salty.